Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast or a series of videos where we, Glenn Ford and Mike Hutchinson, talk about designing better miniature games. We have spoken at length on numerous occasions about all the topics that we can think of related to designing better miniature games. And in case we forget all the things that we said, we have written them down. We have written them down in this book so that you can read them. So this is the fundamentals of tabletop miniature games design, a designer's handbook that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks in the relentless promotion of this delightful hardback book, which I
Paperback
hope
book.
will be of interest to you. If you are watching this channel, then the three people that would be interested in this are, number one, if you are a budding miniature games designer, you will find everything that you would possibly want that is available in print. Uh, about designing miniature games. And if you are an experienced miniature games designer, I hope, as I found in this book, that you will find some ideas, some new ideas, some challenging ideas, and a reference manual, so that when you are bumping up against a design challenge, you can bump your head into this book and get unblocked. But if you are not a designer of miniature games, but you simply are interested in them, you like playing them, you like understanding how they work, this will also be of interest, and it will, I hope, enhance your enjoyment of miniature gaming by giving you a walkthrough of all the different things that go into making these. Now, over the last couple of videos, we've talked about the different sections of this book. We talked about the sort of philosophical opening of the book, about what is the actual essential nature of these sorts of games that are a bit like Warhammer. And we concluded that they were non-discrete miniature games. Then we talked in the second section about all of the basic building blocks that you use to construct these games out of. And in the third and final section of this book, which we will talk about now, we cover the actual implementation of the various rule systems that you will almost certainly find in these kinds. So it seemed obvious that we needed to create chapters on basic stuff like how do you move, how do turns get structured, how do activations happen, how do you deal with ranged interactions and close combat and all that good stuff. So there are a ton of chapters in the second half that make up, in many regards, the sort of practical meat of this book about how you would go about building miniatures rules systems, or miniature rules systems. I like a rules light game.
Yes, but
And
the
Glenn talked about this before, that like writing this book was a bit like writing a rule book, and this section here is the most like writing a rule book, because this is just in the order that we would normally provide this information to you in one of our rule books,
yeah,
starting with setup and deployment and moving through activation and movement and all that good stuff.
you could probably pull those chapter titles out and drop them straight into a rule book, and that would be pretty much how you'd want to lay it out and go through it. So I think the section 3 is actually the largest of the three sections for sheer page count.
Yeah, it's mostly half the book, I think.
Yeah, and so this is the sort of the hardcore horny-handed sons of the soil shovel work making of a game bit of the book. And yeah, this is
And
where
a lot of this stuff is using the research that we have done, looking at other people's games, and just sort of itemizing and categorizing the patterns that we see in existing games, and trying to label them and give them sensible, sort of usefully abstracted names, so that when we're looking at deployment zones across all these different games that we've been interacting with, playing, reading, we're like trying to boil them down into sort of their essential salts, so that you can sort of use those as, okay, if I'm thinking about deployment zones, like, have I thought about asymmetrical ones? Have I thought about shared deployment zones? Have I thought about unanchored deployment zones? And we'll go into sort of what we think are useful definitions of each of those, so that you can absorb those opportunities and say, nah, actually, I'm not interested in shared deployment zones. That doesn't make sense for any of the scenarios that I'm working on for this game. But in each of these chapters, there's loads of examples from the games that you have played or read, or maybe might be interested to go and have a look at, because they've got some fun ideas in.
yeah, absolutely. We've tried to put in a bunch of what we call sort of case studies of specific games that do a particular thing in an interesting way. And like I said before, we then try and say what that game is achieving by putting that mechanic in, how it's achieved, how it sort of pays out, and why it's part of the hopefully successful bits of that given game. I think one of the things interesting overall about sort of writing this section is like we talk about tropes, genre tropes, but I think they're often like tropes of designing these games, and it's like
Yep.
there's almost a sort of a pool of, I don't know, folk knowledge of like, well, this is how this mechanic works, this is how this thing works. And it's like one of the things that came up particularly like in the line of sight chapter is there's an assumption by some games that people already know what you mean by make sure that model can see that model.
Mm.
It's bizarre that there are games out there that just say make sure the two models can see each other and then resolve shooting. And it's like, well, how do I make sure they can see each other? Generally, to find out if somebody can see something, what I do is lean over to them and say, "Can you see that?" And they'd either say yes or no. I can't. I clearly can't do that with a miniature. What am I meant to do? And a lot of games just go, the usual, the
Yeah.
standard
The way
way.
your grandpappy did.
Yeah, what the thing
This
we
this this came up last night in my game of 40k actually, because we were playing a small game of 40k, and normally we'd play on a 6x4 table, and normally deployment zones are 12 inches, obviously, and we shrunk the game to a 36-inch table to play with tiny armies. And my opponent, who is less familiar with the tropes of miniature gaming, started to deploy 12 inches in. I was like, no, we're playing on a small table. It's going to be 6 inches. Like, obviously, it's going to be 6 inches. Like, these are just things that your grandmother taught you.
Yeah, absolutely. And always one of our things I think on this channel and again throughout the book is challenging both the assumptions that are sort of concreted in various areas and to go like maybe don't do that, maybe
Mm.
think of a different way of doing it, maybe that will make your game more interesting and sing a little bit, and also to say normal people don't know this. People, this
Right.
is
Yeah.
this is not like walking and eating. This is a thing that you should be telling people how to do,
Yeah.
because it's shocking. Like the high end, sort of uh, producers and people who kind of should know better, who put out books that just assume that this is common knowledge because they've been gaming for 30 odd years and
Mm.
this is sort of entrenched in their bones, and
Yeah.
it's not a reasonable assumption. And it's one of those things I think that's interesting when you look at like boxed board games, is that they assume very, very little. It's like they assume you don't know how to pick up a playing card sometimes. And yet we sort of throw in massive assumptions of really specific niche knowledge. And hopefully,
Which to a degree is an essential piece of jargon shortcutting that we have to rely on.
mm,
But all of these places are worth examining for sure.
absolutely. So yeah, so what's the chapter listing? What shall we
Well,
talk?
so after the deployment chapter, which is which we covered a little bit there. I think the most interesting, like one of the most interesting chapters for me was the initiative and activation chapter, and that's where we publish in black and white our new taxonomy for IGO UGO / alternating activations. It is dead. Let us never speak of it again. And actually, I was having a conversation with someone. Someone dropped a comment on a recent Hobgoblin video and went, "Oh, it doesn't use alternating activation. Boo." I was like, "Well, okay. Let me just give you a little TED talk here on why partial force activation is sometimes inferior to full force activation." And so we talk about full force activation, partial force activation, and single unit activation because they are all meaningfully different and they all have different kind of design reasons for including. And I think particularly identifying partial force activation as a third type of activation is useful because not enough games have engaged with the idea that rather than one unit or all of my units, there are interesting possibilities in the middle, like activating 3 units, giving you some fungible tokens to allow you to activate between 1 and 3 units. Like there's loads of fun things that you can do there. And as game designers, we know that the activation and initiative system is one of the funnest and like most sort of free to be messed about with systems. but the general gaming population has been introduced to iGo Yugo through Warhammer and alternating activations through all skirmish games ever, and have strong feelings about those things. And we wanted to capture what we think the meaningful differences between them and to give them names that don't suck.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people's journey through the miniatures gaming space is I go, you go with Warhammer, becoming disillusioned with Warhammer, meeting alternating activation with their like new favorite skirmish game, and therefore I go, you go is old and sad and horrible and attached to disgusting things, and only alternating activation is the way for the future. And it's just saying, look, I go, you go has good things to it, things you can
Mm,
maybe pull out by phasing that, or going with partial force, or yeah, consider I go you go. It's not a dead system. It should be a dead name, but
mm.
because that yeah, I go you go and alternating activation are literally synonyms. And so full force activation has good things about it, and it has things that reward you depending on your design decisions, your goals, and it should not be thrown out without consideration. As
Yeah, and if you're doing full force activation, you can also consider like even a bit. So I ended up mentioning Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse, the 2019 version, quite a few times during this book because I just think whoever was working on that game really had their head screwed on. um, but that uses some ideas from historical gaming about detachment based activation, where essentially you split your big army into three quite big armies, and then you get to move three armies, and we alternate the moving of quite large armies, so you get all the fun of like a big strategic sweeping move, but you get some of that fun of like, oh, I'm gonna have a go, then you're gonna have a go, then I'm gonna have a go, then you're gonna have a go. And particularly when you're using lots of models, as you are in lots of games, even 2,000 points of Warhammer 40,000 can be quite a lot of models. This idea that like I'm not going to activate like one little dude and then you'll act one little dude, but that maybe three, two, three battalions or whatever is or detachments is quite a fun way to break up the exchange of game state. Is I don't know, feels like there's parts of the historical space that know this very well, and there are other parts of particularly the skirmish market where moving three models out of my eight might be super interesting, but it's not done that much.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, the big one of the big rewards that full force activation gives you is coordinated activation. So I know
Mm,
that this unit is going to be there when that unit gets there because nobody gets to do anything in between those two movements. I can
yeah.
support things, and those are nice, simulationist and interesting things. It is interesting to have units supporting other units,
Mm.
kind of obviously.
Yeah, and it allows you to combine rules and combine those physical auras and all that good stuff.
Yeah, and obviously the downtime element is a big problem, but it's pretty rare when you move an entire full force that every single one of those units is supporting every single one of the other units, and then we go, okay, are only three units ever really supporting each other at a time? Why not let people activate three units at a time? Why not do
Mm.
your Frostgrave thing where this dude gets to activate two nearby dudes, and we've got our partial force activation, and
Yeah.
we are still essentially taking chunky turns back and forth, but we're not suffering suffering activation advantage and things of that nature. Because again, we've spoken about this before. Yes, downtime is the demon of full forced activation, but activation advantage is the demon of single model activation. And it's interesting to me sometimes. I sort
Well,
of
I think also like I I also find that the exchange of like priority threat, priority threat, priority threat, like there is a to a degree a tediousness to alternating activation where it's just like I see a threat. What's the best tool for that job? Well, I better go and do that because I'm an idiot if I don't do that. Like it
yeah.
just it can in some cases just be a less interesting decision space.
Yeah, absolutely. Alternating activation can result in a game that is just two priority lists mashing into each other and going like, well, that's my number one threat priority. That's my number one threat dealing priority. I activate that first to deal with that, and I go down the list, and you do the same. and that poops out our win. And fiddling with those things, and I say, I've seen like first time designs or prototype designs that have clear activation advantage problems, and I say, what have you put in to deal with activation advantage? And the response is, I don't know what activation advantage is.
Mm.
Alternating activations, single model activation is the thing that cool hot indie games do, so I am doing it. I'm not
Yeah,
aware
yeah,
that there's like a huge crashing problem with it, and it's like there really is, until you've been absolutely tabled by a really experienced player leveraging activation advantage against you. You don't understand how unbelievably horrible a gameplay experience that can be, where you're just, okay, now sit there for 5 minutes while I just wipe out everything you did and then slap you in the face a few times. Fun.
yeah. And it quite often happens with like rubbishy hordy armies like goblins or whatever. But there, you feel like it's not going to matter because like, well, they're weedy and they can't do anything. It's except if you've built an objective based system and they just, you spend the first half of the turn doing some work and they spend the rest of the turn undoing all of your work without you being able to say anything.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like some people balance units on paper going, well, one of these guys can take down three of those guys, that guy gets three and that guy gets
Mm.
one. I've mathed it all out. This is totally fine. I've put in objectives because objectives are sexy and give you different ways of playing. And then you actually emerge that on the tabletop, and the three people are wildly better than the one person because you've made the game interestingly not just about two people kicking each other to death,
Mm.
and then your maths just goes out the window for the effectiveness of a unit because you've changed what effectiveness is, and considering those things is obviously
Yeah. And then
essential.
the rest of that chapter is, we talked about all of the wonderful initiative and activation and bag pulling and pushing your luck. And like, there's a million ways of slicing the turn up. And so we go into as many of those as we can in useful ways. And then we move on to some of the other like things that you're going to have to put in. So like movement rules, for example. We've tried to capture some of the hip and fashionable thoughts about measureless movement and gridded movement and whether gridded movement belongs in these kinds of games, which of course it does and it can. And we called measureless movement zoned movement, which is potentially a strange definition or rather a implementation specific decision, but like um the all of the implementations that we've seen so far are essentially zoning movement.
Yeah, well, I think it's, as far as I can see, and this is, I think, an area that's going to develop hopefully with designers getting their teeth into a little bit more.
Mm.
Whether or not the zone is incredibly small or incredibly like terrain specifically designed, it seems to me that measureless movement effectively breaks the table into zones. It's like, well, there's a wall there
You
with
have to put barriers or boundaries somewhere, otherwise it's literal infinite movement.
absolutely, and like those barriers might mean that the zones are shifting and are different for different miniatures, and it doesn't have to be like, well, I drew hard and fast zones onto the table and that's what we used. But abstractly, it seems that measureless movement creates a set of zone blocks on the tabletop, and operating around those zone blocks is, I think, it seems to me, the strongest way of thinking about that particular system. But
Yeah.
again, this is one of those areas that's barely been explored at this point, and
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of trying to feel it out and say, okay, it seems to be this, it seems to be that. You
And
know,
I think one of the most interesting things about that is that, we were talking about how there's a lot of folk wisdom and received understanding. Like people just aren't familiar enough with zoned movement or measureless movement in general to sort of to grok it yet. And so there's going to be a few more attempts at trying to figure out what like the most sensible implementation of this is, and then hopefully we'll kind of land on something that begins to get accepted as a obvious and easy way of doing it. What I think is interesting is that to my mind it is quite terrain related,
mm,
and so the relationship of measureless movements to the physicality of a given table, I think, puts pressure on the game design in the same way that powerful shooting relates to, terrain layout, and we've all
Mm.
played miniature games which have basically been bust because there was, the incorrect terrain versus what the game was essentially designed to accept. And I think that measureless movement is going to be kind of the same as that. Like, people are going to have to figure out like what is a good table setup for measureless movement in the same way as like what is a good table setup for powerful shooting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, terrain and table setup is such an important. We've spoken about this so many times. I think such an important part of these games, and something that is so often barely touched on by the rule book. And
Yeah.
considering how the game shifts if somebody sets up the terrain wrongly or not the way that you pictured they were going to do so, I think is a vital.
Yeah, and it's bizarre if you think about that in terms of like digital games where like, you know, can you imagine a game that like spends an enormous amount of time working on its like first person shooter mechanics to make sure the guns feel good and the balance with the enemy of damage types is right, and then just doesn't write any levels and
Hmm.
just goes like, oh yeah, yeah, here's just some level blocks, like all the levels have to be designed by the player just before they play the first person shooter. Like, that'd be insane.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and sort of, and the fact that we haven't gone with a sort of procedural generation of the tabletop. We've said you use your best judgment, and well, okay, this was my best judgment for all the. I've built up like years of experience playing game X, and so this is how I lay out my terrain. You say your game's interesting and innovative. Well, you're also asking me to rely on that built up experience. So it better not be innovative in a way where that built up experience ruins your game dead in the water, because otherwise your game is going
Yeah,
to
and I think that this,
experience.
when it comes to measureless movement, I think this is really, really challenging
Mm,
because I have learnt from many years of playing skirmish war games that little scrubby bits of like hedges and fences ultimately, they end up being something that I can abstract to a degree because, they're annoying and they fall over and the bases are slightly too big for the size of the miniatures and so forth. And so like, I'm used to like line of sight blocking terrain and a little western town with buildings and stuff, but like when you're creating zoned movement, you're going to have to be initially for the first couple of years here much more specific about like, is it okay that I have like a central corridor down the center of the table, which, ordinarily would be like an obvious fire lane, but I've got lots of side streets. But now it's not an obvious fire lane, it's an infinite movement corridor. Like, how do I break that up? Like, what am I providing as a designer in terms of either specific layouts or generalized advice of how to solve that?
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, completely switching up the whole pathfinding system of the games, I think, is a huge. Yeah, because like you say, a hedge in a normal skirmish game is a sort of a barely. It's like, oh, it takes an inch off your movement, and you
Yeah,
totally
if we even
pathfind.
bother mentioning it.
Yeah, and you can totally pathfind round it, you swerve around it, just doesn't matter. In a measureless movement game, it suddenly becomes like, okay, how many turns does it take me to go to the hedge, move along the hedge, go through the hedge, go back in the hedge, continue? Oh, it's the whole game getting around that hedge now in these new movement rules.
Hmm.
That's a huge difference. That's a huge play.
Or that the presence of the hedge represented a minor inconvenience or a minor sort of debuff for shooting in my first skirmish game, but now in my second skirmish game it's like a fundamental dividing line between two zones, and it creates the space of play in a way that it carries so much more weight in that second system than it does in that first one. And so
Hmm.
it suddenly matters a crap ton more whether there's a hedge there in the middle of my little pathway.
Yeah, so lots on terrain movement. We've sort of mentioned shooting there. Obviously, there's a section on shooting, or ranged resolution of.
Yeah, and the ranged resolution stuff, like, it was difficult to unpack line of sight and ranged actions and terrain, and so they ended up being kind of, we spent two chapters really digging into a lot. We said the dice chapter was pretty big. The terrain chapter ended up being an absolute behemoth.
Hmm. But again, it's, as I say, it's like writing a rule book a lot of the time, where you're sort of going, okay, well, I want to talk about line of sight. I can't talk about line of sight until I've talked about terrain, but I can't define the terrain until I've defined line of sight, and I can't do. And yeah, a lot of these things are sort of interlinked and interlocking. But yeah, we've tried to pin down the bits and pieces that relate to that in a way that is sort of intelligible reading through from chapter to chapter. But I think a lot of people are going to pick and choose which chapter they look into in the book anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the terrain section, we've tried to itemize all the common types of terrain that we've seen a million times, just so that you've got all those in front of you and you don't have to, go and research them from other books. Then we talk about morale, which we generalize as control removal. So something in the rule system temporarily takes control of a model away from a player. And that could be because they're really angry or they're really scared, or they're breaking from combat or something. We've talked on a couple of videos about the number of challenging elements that removing a player's agency over their own models introduces.
Mm.
And so we talk and sort of pin down some of those. Haha, pinning is a kind of control removal.
Yeah. So I think we refer to generally as control removal because it might not be down to morale issues, but it like 90% of the time is. And obviously, yeah, games are about interesting decisions and about agency and about power fantasies. And as soon as you monkey with a player's agency and their power and their control, you're juggling a spicy meatball.
But it is a delicious meatball if you get it right, because
Mm,
as we know from talking earlier in the book about like emergent storytelling and emergent kind of narrative beats that can come out, like having things temporarily taken out of the hands of the player. It's like in a role-playing game where like
mm,
I'm getting to a point in the story where I would like to be uncertain about the outcome. In these games, you know whether it's morale or whether it's losing control in Gaslands, like the idea that the game suddenly just whisks away the game state from you and pops it a little bit further over here where you weren't expecting it. And you're like, oh, great. Okay, now I've got a slightly different kind of tactical challenge to deal with. That can be super interesting.
yeah, and narratively, the fact that these little dudes are human beings with their own opinions about the suicide mission that you're sending them on
Mm,
can very quickly tell an awful lot of story.
mm,
Where you're like, just rush the guns, and the dude goes, "No,
mm.
absolutely not. It's suicide. I'm going to
Yeah,
go and hide
Jenkins
behind this
refuses.
wall." Can very quickly go like, "Yeah, an actual." Sort of active individual that has opinions that differ from mine, and but keeping that a tasty, interesting moment, a powerful narrative moment, rather than a oh good, I don't get to do anything again, oh brilliant, the roll came up badly, now I get to sit here for a turn going, I'm not playing the game anymore, game's playing itself.
Yeah, and even the way I described control removal there is like locked in with my fundamental uh, principle that all game mechanics should be pushing the game forward and they shouldn't
Mm,
be resulting in null outcomes. Like control removal, it absolutely gets implemented in loads of places as can I do a thing? Game says no, you cannot do a thing. And I
mm.
just think there are better ways of writing games than that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think again one of our mantras is for moments of something rather than moments of nothing,
Yeah.
and yeah, absolutely. It
And it
seems
can even be it can even be counterintuitive stuff like can I do a thing, the dice say I can't do a thing, instead Glenn gets to do a thing, like you
yeah,
refused to charge the guns so the guns get to fire or something.
yeah, absolutely. Or just like the idea that okay, this person is terrified out of their mind, running on like desperate survival, and so what they do is just not fire their gun today. It's like, why, what the hell, why is he not running like
Mm,
berserker screaming through his own unit, diving
mm,
into a foxhole, battering to death the guy that's in there, and then crying for the next? It's like that's what happens when someone's terrified out of their mind. They don't just
mm.
go null happens, and like, yeah, trying to figure out ways to go, yeah, have this trigger and then have a really dramatic and interesting story beat moment occur, and then let's move on from it,
Mm.
rather than just like, okay, what has happened is that the off switch has been turned on this bit of your fun engine, and it's going to stay in the off position probably for quite a while,
Right, yeah, it's a
you know
stalling engine, it's not an exciting crash.
yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of crashes, there's a chapter on damage.
Hmm.
um because a lot of these games have damage, and even if you made one with with no violence in, you still want sort of uh resource removal from the other player, because as we said before, like when you think about this in terms of activation points and wounds, like I start with some resources on the table and some opportunities through time, and those get eroded either by me taking actions or you taking actions and taking them away from me. And so the way that wounds work, I think is super interesting. It's also just a very common and dramatic part of any turn.
Yeah, absolutely. And like there needs to be, hopefully there is a good level of interactivity in one of these games. These are high interactivity games by and large. And that's going to mean at some point I'm going to set you back in some way in your plans. I'm going to degrade your forces, ruin your ideas.
Mm,
And how that remains interesting and fun and challenging rather than just handcuffing you, to the table and then playing without you. Because it's like, I want to be able to push you back and to challenge you, but then I want you to come back at me. I
mm,
genuinely don't. I don't want a game where I just go, well, I turned this switch, and that switch, and now you're out, and now watch while I do things. That's not a two-player interactive game. That's a I found the off switch, and now it's a solo game that I can't lose. It's a
yeah.
solo game that is
That's the playing out of a magic combo.
yeah, no, absolutely. And it's like it has to be challenging and interesting for that to happen. And how your damage mechanics work, how much of a snowballing downslide it gives one player, how that other player gets to respond, how they get to continue to interact even as you take away their weapons from them. These I think are all vital questions in creating a interesting feel good thing for both people, because I want the person doing the hitting to feel powerful and cool and that they're achieving things. I don't want it to just be like, no, nobody ever gets, these are all Nerf guns and nothing ever happens. But at the same time, I want them. It's more exciting that even as you're hitting somebody to think, but they're going to come back in a second. Oh my goodness, I've got to make this punch count, because if he doesn't go down, he's going to tear me in half. So
Mm.
yeah, balancing those things, figuring them out, I think is central, definitely.
I think one thing that I quite like, I was quite satisfied about in the wounds chapter, is there's a bit at the end of the wounds chapter about like recovery, healing, summoning, reinforcements. And because at this point we've built up the language to talk about this, like we can talk in very brief, sort of pregnant terms about how, like, the problem with healing and summoning and recovery mechanics is like we are recovering resources that were supposed to be forcing the game towards its laddering state, and so now we're introducing it's zeroing state, so now we're sort of introducing laddering mechanics where I'm potentially introducing both reversal of player actions but also like new potential elements that come in. Summoning particularly interacts with activation advantage in a really challenging way, and having this language around the sort of the resource nature of these games. I don't know. It's pleasing because it allowing us to talk quite quickly about some important things, and where summoning and reinforcements might work, but they are going to change. They're going to change the tempo of the game. They're going to change the place that they're going to move the decision curve around and reintroduce decisions where you might have been on a nice sort of ramp down to the most interesting part of the game, and now you're changing that and altering it by introducing those new resources.
Yeah, it's like I've been playing quite a bit of Magic the Gathering Arena at the moment, and one of the things that's interesting design wise is the times when a Magic game completely flunks because someone's got a control deck and what they're doing each turn is undoing what you did on your turn, and they're hoping that they hit a certain thing that will come out later on that will actually win them the game, and then that thing doesn't come out, and so what just happens is I do a thing, well I undid the thing, I do the thing, well I'll undo the thing, well I did, until you literally like one card mill your entire deck for like half, and it's like brilliant. That was great. I'm really glad we
Gripping fun.
We both did that. Big fun. Good for us. And it's like, yeah, whenever you put in something that essentially just undoes what the other person just did, it has to do something else. There has to be something else in there. I have to undo what you did while progressing the game state. I have
Yeah,
to do it by
and
like,
in a game of Magic, you're trying to ladder up to the point where you've got powerful monsters and powerful combos, and you've built capabilities. In this, you're trying to zero down to like, well, I'm trying to eliminate units to try and focus where the strategy is. And if you keep bringing them in, and it's just like it just makes the end of the game keep getting further away. It isn't necessarily increasing interest; it's just increasing game length.
yeah, I think like healing mechanics are one of those things that get put into games like, well, obviously there's some kind of healer. That's a new troop type that I can have,
Mm.
presumably open up interesting mechanics for people. Stick it in, let's see. And it's like, well, what you've done there is you've just put a break on the game. It's just to slow down. You know, you haven't thought about how the resources get moved. Because if it's like, oh, he heals by like pulling things out of other units and moves wounds around, it's like, well, okay, now everything's the plate of armor to this one unit. That can be interesting. We can play with that.
Yeah,
But if all he is like, well, my general's got 4 extra wounds, just give the general 4 extra wounds. Let's move.
yeah. If the medic is just printing money, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah. So what else have we got there in that section, if anything?
Yeah, what's left? I mean, there's a few things left in the book that are so the things that are super important that interlock with some of the earlier parts are there is a chapter on victory conditions and there is a chapter on scenarios, and those two link to some ideas that we were talking about in the first section of the book about how, you know, this dirty word about wanting to win a game can be reinterpreted as essentially orienting both players towards a shared set of understandings about what is fun and what predictable behavior they should be exhibiting so the other person can react to it. And as we talked about a few times on this channel, both victory conditions and scenarios have some design gotchas that we have learnt by catching our leg repeatedly in bear traps until the disease has rotted our feet off and we can no longer get caught in them. But there's also some discussion about you know, some of the standards of like, you know, the pre-written scenario format and how you might deploy them, where exactly, like there are some other uses of scenarios that are super interesting. So if you think about the hobby loop and how you want to kind of drag people around multiple loops of the hobby loop so that you can, you know, keep them interested in your game, like scenarios provide super interesting opportunities to do that. Like if you provide places where, you know, they have to build specific forces or they need a particular model to represent an objective or a location. And that leads on to, you know, one of the last chapters, which is about campaigns and how possibly you can structure them. We don't necessarily offer the answers to how to solve them. That is hard, but we do offer some spaces, some ideas about where common problems emerge in writing campaign systems and how you can think about some of those questions of snowballing and getting, you know, getting one player going backwards whilst one player is going forwards, and whether or not you're saying like Necromunda does, like there's loads of cool content in this game but you can't have it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like campaigns is one of those things where, look, there are a set of different ways of structuring a campaign. They all have sort of strengths and weaknesses. This is what some of the ways of structuring them are. This is the upside. This is the downside. I don't
Mm.
necessarily have a cure to all of the downsides. And some of them are about you paying your money, taking your choice, and taking your lumps if you want to put a campaign system in. But it's like, okay, well, here's a converging campaign, here's a straight line campaign, here's a divergent campaign. These have their elements and their concerns. Be aware of them. Pick one. You know, understand that they're going to have issues, but they're going to have rewards, and to a degree, sort of, yeah, move on from that. And yeah, like you
It's
say,
also it's challenging because campaign design is, it's both really hard and in some cases it doesn't really matter, because a lot of times campaign design is about selling people the dream, and whether
hmm,
or not they execute on that dream is much less important than the dream being present.
yeah,
So I think as a designer I'm quite chill. Like I know that there are challenges and I know that, you know, many more people will read my campaign system than play it, but those people that read the campaign system may play more of my game because of the the dream, even
Yeah,
though
I
the
mean,
next few aren't.
campaign systems are by and large going to be played by your super fans, and
Mm.
they're already your super fans, and they will sometimes put up with a lot of guff. That said, there are there are absolutely like skirmish games where like campaign or progression systems usually are like central to the experience. There are
Totally,
some
yeah.
where it's like it barely makes sense playing, some games without. It's like Frostgrave is a great example of a very popular game that it's hard to not play it with the campaign system and get the full juice out of it. And yeah, like you say, scenarios. Sorry to like double back. One of these things where it's like they're totally central to design. They're always one of the last few things you can do because you need everything else in place. You're pretty sure you understand the system. You're exhausted from writing it. This is a really important thing you're working on, and sometimes you just go, okay, I'm pretty sure this will work because I understand the system. And like you say, there are some simple traps that are like, oh, if a miniature can step off the table during a scenario, put a big red hat on that rule and worry about it a lot because there's a lot of
Yeah, because
scenarios.
you will get to the scenarios and you'll think, oh, that's clever. Let's have a game where if you execute the general, you get a load of victory points. Great, I'll just walk the general off. You
Yeah,
can't have the victory points.
yeah, absolutely. Number of scenarios we've played where turn one I've gone. So can I just go boof, move that guy off, and now you can't win? It's either a draw
Yeah.
or I win now,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
and it and it's funny because like the scenarios again, like thinking about the terrain setups, like the scenarios are a piece of content, they aren't core to the system, but once you've got the system working, how the table is set up and what the victory conditions are, they're very variable and you can offer lots of them, but they are essentially the level design for your game. Like all of the system is pointless and won't, is not put in motion until there's the scenario. And that's why I will often recommend like concentrate on one scenario, get your game humming with one scenario before you start introducing loads of scenarios. Because if you start by going, well, I've got a great rule system, now I need 12 scenarios, guarantee someone is going to, their first experience will be the scenario that doesn't work and they figure out that it's broken, and your whole system is undermined by a piece of content that wasn't even part of the system.
yeah, and it's like, you can spend a lot of time on a shooting resolution system, let's say, and it might be that nobody interacts with that shooting system for a particular game because shooting might or might not happen, but they'll definitely be playing a scenario.
Mm,
They'll definitely be actually using the scenario because you cannot play the game without it. But
mm,
every other part basically is coincidental. It might or might turn up, but the scenario
mm.
is going to be in there. So you really want to get that right and singing.
So I think I'll just briefly mention the last part of the book is about list building and how you might think about force, offering factions and forces. And throughout this whole sort of third section, we have been building up a kind of library of available solutions for all of these sections. And so given that we had kind of concluded that there are all these different insects and we'd stuck little pins on them for all the different sections, so in activation we know what all the different kinds of activations are. For ranged attacks we know what kind of ranged sort of patterns we can go for. We stuck them all in a tool for you. So the final thing to worth that's worth mentioning is that available digitally as a companion to this book is the miniature game prototyping tool, which we'll link in the down belows. And that is a web page that basically kind of collects together all of these ideas that we have captured about different system implementations. And so you can press a button and it will create you a fully functioning miniatures rule set that goes through all the different parts of a game that you will need rule systems for, and offers you one of the possible answers. So it might tell you that you're using, a full force activation system, or it might tell you that you're using, a dice pool resolution system. And that is to prove once and for all what we've been saying for years, which is you can't just throw together a bunch of mechanics and expect a game to emerge, which is unfortunately something that we see quite a lot in early game design kind of journeys for people, which is fine. It's a great place to start, but all of this stuff about how you evoke the fantasy, how the mechanics link to the conceits that you're providing, and how you deal with all the emergent problems from your particular cocktail of mechanics. Those are where the game design is. Coming up with, reading a bunch of other games and combining those pre-existing systems is a good starting place, but it is just a starting place.
Yeah, I think that the system is in there because it's like throughout the book we say, okay, here are some like exercises. Try doing this instead of that in your game and see what happens. Try doing
Mm-hmm.
this instead of that and see how it affects things, and like think about what that means. And the assumption is you're going to come to the game with the book with a game that you're working on
Mm.
or a game that you're familiar with. But if you're not either of those things, you don't want to do the exercises with either of those things, we've put this thing in so you can go like, well, punch it out, bang, there's a little generic game for you, twiddle the bits of that and see what happens. But yes, there is a secondary challenge to say your game has to be better than what our automated game generator makes,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of games that aren't, that don't have more imagination than just like putting all the rules in a bag, shaking it, and pulling them out again.
And it's really fun because there are certain kinds of games for which you can do this. So, I am on some level inspired by, I forget the name of it. There is a fairly famous role-playing game generator that does a similar thing, because role-playing games, the system can be quite core and very flexible, and then the fantasy that you lay around it can be extremely, variable. That's why role-playing games have so many like general systems that lots of people end up reusing for their games. But you can't really imagine this happening for board games in anything resembling the same way. But because miniature games are at their heart like an operating system with a few kind of common rule systems, it's possible to create a generator that makes a pretty convincing looking game, but it doesn't connect with anything, and so it won't inspire love in the players, because it's not connected to the fantasy that's trying to evoke. But anyway, so click on that, have a little click around, and the code is available in open source. The output that it creates is available in open source, so you're free to use our text and mash it into your own game if you want to use it as a starting point or as a prototype tool. And if you come up with other mechanics or other ways of kind of introducing different patterns into it, like, just let us know. I'm super interested to keep that tool up to date. Uh, as we learn more about zoned movement, I might keep it up to date with the new technology that's emerging there. But no doubt, and hopefully, we will find more technology to support our miniature game fun.
Absolutely. So that's all going to be in the down belows, along with a link across to CRC where you can order the book.
Buy this book.
It will definitely be out by the time this video comes
I
out.
promise you, this will be the last video that we hawk this.
Yes, we'll
That's a
mention
lie.
we'll mention it once or twice.
We might. Yeah.
This will be the last one that we're going this in depth into it. So just swing by the CRC press. Like I say, take a look at the chapter listing, because then you can see sort of the bits we've been talking about and maybe some bits we haven't talked about. You can pick up a copy of the book from there. There'll, as I say, be a link to the game generator, so you can go in there and play and have some fun with it. There'll be linked to the Discord when you can combine, talk about the game it generated for you with other people. You can also swing by to our websites and buy our things, or go across to our Patreons and support us and read our
Thank you if you
blogs
do.
and bits and pieces that support the book and support what we've been talking about here. And while you're down there, swing by the comment section. Tell us about the sections that we've been talking about, the chapters we've discussed, and what you think might be interesting about them. And punch on the like and subscribes. But other than that, I think from this episode, from this Rule of Carnage, it'll be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.
Just realized my hat matches the color of this book. That
I
wasn't a
know
deliberate act.
it's
Bye
delightful.
bye.